Have the map back up. So if we'll stand, we'll say our prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, one God, O Heavenly King, come through the Spirit of truth, whatever present to us to all things, the treasury of good things, and give our life, come and abide in us, cleanse us from every stain, and save our souls, O good one. Enlighten the eyes of our mind, also teachings, and implant in us the fear of thy blessed commandments. By learning to do thy will in all things, we may more perfectly praise thee, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, now and ever, and unto ages of ages. Amen. The map is being held up by our numerous extra save the date magnets for the festival on October 14th. So if you haven't taken your magnet home for the festival to remind yourself, or share them with your coworkers or schoolmates, we still have some of them. As you can see, they're holding up the map. So tonight we're covering the period between 537 and 752 AD. This period is chosen because it's a period that modern scholars call the Byzantine popes, or the Byzantine papacy. And it's the period where the popes of Rome actively sought the approval of their election from the emperor in Constantinople. That once they were elected, they actively sought out his, in a sense, approval of their election as the Pope or as the Bishop of Rome. So that's the period that we're looking at. There are many popes in this period. So to set the time period, I'm going to read to you a short section from a book by Father Andrew Louth, Greek East and Latin West, the Church, AD 681 to 1071. This is the third volume in the Church in History series by SVS Press. This is what he has to say about the West, specifically the West, the Church in the West, what we think of as the West at this time. He says, for most of the West, as for the rest of the Church in the lands that had once formed the Roman Empire, the Church was organized on the basis of Christian communities, ruled by a bishop who was attached to a city. The gradual collapse in most of the West of the political structures of the empire had actually strengthened rather than weakened the link between the bishop and the city. In much of Gaul, remember this is modern-day France, for instance, the old cities only survived if they had acquired a bishop. For it was the presence of a bishop, his cathedral, and administration that came to provide a focus for the city. This is specifically in Western Europe that we're talking about here. By the end of the 7th century, meaning the end of the 600s, the various barbarian kingdoms had long been Christian. The Lombards, which were in northern Italy, coming down towards Rome, and the Anglo-Saxons in England, being the latest to embrace Christianity. They were the last of this group to embrace Christianity. The relationship between the bishops and the military aristocracy provided by the descendants of the barbarians varied. Sometimes, as in Gaul, there was a close relationship, meaning between the bishop and the king. Elsewhere, as with the Lombards, the bishops were marginalized. In northern Italy, that was the case. The Lombards ruled, and the clergy were marginalized by the ruling military kind of aristocracy. He continues. It is perhaps important to remember, too, that despite the apparent fragmentation of the former Roman Empire, remember, we last week discussed about the supposed fall of Rome, and what that meant, what that fall was actually like. That really there wasn't a fall of some catastrophic magnitude that was noticed in a sense by everyone, and that people at that time said Rome has fallen. Nobody said that. The fall of Rome is the idea of the Enlightenment, specifically Edward Gibbons, who writes this monumental historical work, and he pegs the fall of Rome to 476, but that's his opinion. It's an arbitrary choice. Again, because Rome doesn't disappear, the city continues, the bishops are there, they're still government of the city, and the people think of themselves as Romans still, even though Germanic kind of tribes have moved in and kind of taken over much of the power, administrative power or military power of the area. So Father Andrew says, it is perhaps important to remember, too, that despite the apparent fragmentation, he says the apparent fragmentation, of the former Roman Empire at the end of the 7th century, it is doubtful how deeply this fragmentation was felt. Somebody, like the Venerable Bede in England, still felt himself a part of the ancient Roman Empire, now subject to Christ, and had a vivid sense of the place of Rome, the city of Rome, in his understanding of the world. As we shall see, this was shared by those in the lands that had fallen under Islam, in the Far East, where Islam had conquered Jerusalem, and parts of North Africa eventually. So it says the Germanic barbarians had kind of come into this area and taken up kind of political authority in some sense, though they still claimed allegiance to the Roman emperor in Constantinople. The Christians here felt like they were Romans still, as did the Christians in the Middle East, felt like they were still Romans, though they were now under the dominance of Islam. While the Romans, despite their shrunken circumstances, found it difficult to abandon their sense of being Romani, or Romans, it could be said that the Latin West and the Greek East found themselves drawing apart because they shared a sense of being Romans, or at least having the Romans as their ancestors, but found themselves compelled to make sense of this in different ways. So the Christianity had to deal with the empire embracing it. And largely at the time that it did so, all of this was the Roman Empire. And the church spread easily, as we've seen, through that area up into what is modern-day England and Spain, and along the frontier of the Germanic areas, and even over the frontier, Christianity spread, but though largely in the heretical form of Arianism. That's what spread amongst the German barbarians initially. But throughout the Middle East and North Africa, the church rapidly spread after the embrace of the church by the empire. But the church had to respond to that. How do you deal with now that the empire has embraced you, which we've discussed in length in different lectures? But then the western part is invaded by Germanic tribes, and the reality of being Christian and being Roman, which in a sense became synonymous with each other, which to this day it's manifests itself in the Middle East, and the fact that Christians are called the Rum by Muslims. Rum being the Arabic word for Roman. The Christians are the Romans. in the Middle East, still to this day. We have good friends that their last name is Rum. They're from Syria. So, but as the political dimensions changed, right, whether that's under Islam or under the Germanic tribes, the people still had this sense of being Roman, and that was synonymous with being Christian. And so at this period, these things are interconnected. And that's important to understand because the history of the early church is very much in this throughout this period. There's a lot of commonality. There's a lot of cohesion. There hasn't been. You have groups that have gone into schism or into heresy out of the church, but that is not, in a sense, the majority. The Novatianists, the Donatists, and so forth. These are the kind of the purist groups that thought they were, in a sense, more Christian than the Christians. But they're a small kind of set minority present, whereas the culture at large, right, that didn't follow that track. That you have, as some have said, you can go from a church from the Middle East all the way to Spain or up to England, and what you go into, visually, one, you can understand everything that you see, because the forms and the symbols and the iconography all are coherent to you. No matter where you would go, even down into Ethiopia, this would have been the case in the 500s, the 600s, 700s, 800s. This is still the case, even into the 11th and 12th, 13th century. Visually, everything has a cohesion to it within Christendom. Even which you haven't talked about yet, really, but we'll get into iconography in the next lecture, in the age of iconoclasm. Musically, the chanting very much is similar or inspired on the same roots. And as we said, the liturgy or the Mass, right, the rite that is used for the Eucharist is intelligible to everyone. They all go back to the same root. And so there is this common history that everyone can see. Now, there are differentiations and practices and things, but those differentiations have not caused any major conflict yet. Okay. So, to understand this period of the Byzantine, what they call the Byzantine papacy in modern terms, we need to talk about the emperor himself. When Constantine became emperor, he inherited the title Pontifex Maximus. It's one of the many titles for the Roman emperors. The Roman title, this was a pagan title for the Roman emperor. It was a religious title. You have to remember, in the pagan world, the emperor was a political figure as well as a religious figure. He held, in a sense, the position of a kind of priest, in a sense. He would offer sacrifice for the empire, on behalf of the empire. And he was also then seen as being deified eventually, as being kind of a lesser god or a son of the gods up until Constantine's time. But this title, Pontifex Maximus, Pontifex literally means bridge builder, one who builds bridges. Maximus, of course, like you can guess what that means by the word, the maximal bridge builder. So our word maximum comes from this, Maximus, Latin phrase. So the symbolic meaning is he's the one bridging heaven and earth. The emperor is the one bridging heaven and earth. Now, Constantine inherits this title But as a Christian emperor, he could not claim it in the same way the pagan emperors did. This is because Christ himself is truly the Pontifex Maximus. He, in his person, is the one who unites heaven and earth in reality, is Christ. And so all properly meaning that would be a title for him. Also, though, that the bishop and then also the priest in the parish becomes the image of Christ in the church. They become the icon of Christ in the church. And the bishops possess a hierarchical status and authority in the church that the emperor does not possess. So, what power in spiritual matters does the emperor possess, though? This is in the Roman world, the pagan world, the emperor possessed all power, religious and civil. But with this change, this doesn't follow with the change to Christianity, that you have this the same thing being applied. And Constantine himself doesn't claim it in his reign. So the imperator, this is the phrase for emperor, as we call it, that this is the temporal or royal power. And this was understood as responsible for the material and organization and care, order and justice of the empire. And this imperial power, imperator, of the emperor, Constantine strove to bring this into accord with Christian principles. And we, in our other lecture about specifically Constantine, we talked about this, the changes that he made to society and to law, into the order of society. He was trying to bring into the empire, in a sense, the Christianization of those things, or to bring them into alignment, the empire into alignment with those principles. Eusebius, the church historian of the same time period of Constantine, he said that the emperor must frame his earthly government according to the pattern of the divine original. The emperor must frame his earthly government according to the pattern of the divine original. As a Christian emperor, he is responsible, in a sense, for forming society around the divine reality that Moses would have, in a sense, experienced on Mount Sinai. The same kind of idea, the same kind of thing that Israel tried to, the kings of Israel tried to establish in their own reign, in the reign of David, to manifest on earth the reality of what is in heaven to the best of their abilities. And this same idea is then taken up by the Christian emperors as well, that the emperor is responsible for the Christianization of society. He's not responsible for the conversion or initiation of individuals into the church. This is important. He does not have the responsibility, in a sense, to baptize and to catechize people. That is the function of the bishops and the priests. But conversion of society to being Christian is, in a sense, part of his domain. He is the one who orders society, the civil society. So in this sense, he retains this title of Pontifex Maximus, of being the one trying to bridge heaven and earth on a civil level within society. He is the lawgiver, the emperor. The bishops don't try and become the lawgivers of the empire. The emperor is the lawgiver. He stands, in a sense, in the place of Moses, not in the place of Aaron, and not of Christ, who possesses his own high priesthood. The emperor is not seen as being a priest that offers sacrifice anymore. That is separate from the imperial power. That priestly power is removed in a sense from, in the sense of the sacrificial nature of it, is separated. This is a change that occurs in the empire from the emperor's person, and that's retained by the bishops and the priests. Because the bishops and the priests are understood as sharing in the high priesthood of Christ according to Melchizedek, as St. Paul explains in the book of Hebrews. And this is distinct from the priesthood of Aaron. That's partly of what Hebrews is talking about, the distinction between the Aaronic priesthood and Christ's high priesthood. In the past, the pagan emperors were both. They were kings and priests. But rightly speaking, Christ is the only king and priest. Christ is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, and the high priest. He brings all of those things together in himself. And so society is grappling with this, shedding off its pagan past and reforming the empire, reforming in a Christian light. Of course, this is not done perfectly. There's much failure, but there's much success in all of this. The Mosaic law becomes the measure by which Roman law is then judged and baptized. And you have this occurring, the revision of Roman law under the Emperor Theodosius, the great Theodosian Code. This is the emperor during the Second Ecumenical Council, St. Theodosius the Great. And then under the Emperor Justinian, he does a further revision of Roman law, and it's called the Code of Justinian, which remains the law of the empire until its collapse in 1453. And it becomes the law, the basis of law for all of the Germanic tribes. They base their law on the Justinian Code because they see themselves in continuity with the empire. This is the case. France, Germany, Spain, and so forth, Italy. And that's in some sense, it's still retained to this day in certain countries, that the Justinian Code still kind of underlies the basic legal rationale in many European countries. But for the sake of Christian society, the emperors were seen as justified then in calling councils of bishops and participating in them to a degree. The bishops, guided by the Holy Spirit, deliberated and decided whatever the council was grappling with. It's the bishops that made those decisions. But the emperors were seen as the ones to enact them in society and to uphold the decision. The upholder of the decision, the actor of it. The bishops decree, this is the faith, this is the truth, this is the reality of existence, because that's what true doctrine is expressing, what is real. And therefore the emperors have to take that and then try to implement that in society for the benefit of all of the citizens of that empire. The bishops did not possess, the emperor was seen to possess the royal authority of the imperator from Christ, who is the King of Kings. So Christ is the King of Kings, and therefore he gives, in a sense, he gives authority to kings. This was the idea, the Christianization of the empire, that the authority of the emperor isn't the emperor's alone. He's not divine anymore. This is, again, a radical shift from what was before. Instead of the emperor being divine, now he serves the divine. There is a higher authority than the emperor, which is Christ himself. And the emperor has to submit to that authority. But his authority as emperor is coming from above, from Christ, from the King of Kings. And from the fact that Christ is in his earthly life acknowledges Caesar's temporal authority. This is also significant because when Christ is confronted by the Pharisees and says, should you be paying your taxes? He says, well, whose coin is that? Whose image is on it? And they said, Caesar's. And he said, well, give Caesar what belongs to Caesar and give to God what belongs to God. Christ is not seen as, in a sense, fighting the imperial authority, but acknowledging that it exists. And then what does the church do? It doesn't try to overthrow the empire through the time of persecution. It lives through it. And then it tries to baptize the empire. It doesn't ever try to overthrow it. So this is what's going on. This movement, this kind of discernment of how do you do this? How do you bless this? How do you make it holy? The bishops did not possess this imperial authority or claim to possess this authority at this time in history. They acknowledge royal authority was of divine origin. This is why in the church still this day we pray for the civil authorities, whatever civil authorities they may be. The bishops were to ensure that the emperor was upholding the right faith, but the emperor was to organize the society around that right faith. That's how, in a sense, that was the structure of civilization, Christian civilization at this point. So it is in this light that when the emperor, within the empire, the bishops of Constantinople and Rome would seek the approval of their election from the emperor in this context. Of Rome, at least during the period when the city of Rome had been incorporated back into the central administration of the empire, not just on its periphery. So remember, from the mid-400s into the mid-500s, Italy was very much controlled by the Ostrogoths, who presented themselves as being loyal to the emperor, but very much ran the show of things. Society still retained its Roman identity, in a sense, but the Ostrogoths were like, the pretenders that were there, they're the ones who had the authority. Now, and this is what we went through last week, how this was overthrown at the very end, that in 536, Belisarius, the emperor of Justinian, retakes much of the Italian peninsula, including the city of Rome. And it's at that point the city of Rome now comes back under imperial authority, directly under, not through a federati. That's what the title was for these Germanic military leaders or kings. They were the federati. They were the friends or the allies of the emperor. Instead, now it's not the federati governing; it's the empire directly through an imperial exarch who is based in Ravenna. That's where the imperial power resides. Rome is important because it's the old capital, and there's so many martyrs there, and it's a place of pilgrimage in the ancient world, even at this point. So once it's back under direct Roman authority, the popes, upon their election, seek the approval of the emperor of Constantinople. And the Apocrysaria is the name of the person who was the representative of the Pope to the emperor in Constantinople. In a sense, he was like the ambassador from the Church of Rome to the Church of Constantinople and to the imperial court. Now, this structure of things continues to this day. So our Patriarchate of Antioch has a representative, in a sense, a church, a specific church in different locations in the jurisdiction of other Orthodox churches, and that it's like a little embassy of the Church of Antioch to Russia or Serbia or Romania, Bulgaria, and so forth, to Constantinople. That you have this one church with a priest usually, or a bishop, and they're, in a sense, the ambassador of the Church of Antioch to this other church. That this still functions to this day. And we have this even in the United States, where you have these representation present, even though there's no churches under the jurisdiction, they still have a church in the United States, usually New York City or somewhere. And so this kind of ambassadorial structure was retained in the church as it was found in the empire. Okay, questions on that? So many of the bishops of Rome come from the men who served in this position in this time period, from the Apocrypharia. They also come from the inhabitants of Greece, Syria, and Sicily at this point, between these this 200-year period. And so you might be thinking, well, Greece and Syria, right? They're going back and forth and so forth. Sicily, though, is important. Here's Sicily. The boot is kicking Sicily. That's the island. We need a little Sicilian history. So Sicily began to be colonized by the Greeks in the 8th century BC. Initially, this was restricted to the eastern and southern parts of the island. The most important colony was established in a city called Syracuse in 734 BC. It long endured as a Greek colony through the Roman Empire. Amongst the earliest Christian martyrs were the Sicilians St. Agatha of Catania and St. Lucy of Syracuse. Right? We think of these as Western saints, but they likely spoke Greek, because that's what they were. They were ethnically or culturally Greek. Sicilian churches followed the Eastern Rite of services at this time. The same was true of Calabria, the toe of the boot, and parts of southern Italy followed the Eastern Rite up until the 11th century, I think, or later. And this was because this was a part of, longer than Rome itself, of the empire. Rome had fallen to the Ostrogoths, but Sicily and the southern section, the heel and the toe of the boot, had been retained as part of the empire because it was a largely Greek-speaking population, and following the practices of the Eastern rites as found in Constantinople. Sicily was then conquered by Muslims in the 10th century, and then in the 11th century, Normans, led by Roger I, conquered Sicily. The most significant changes that the Normans were to bring to Sicily were in the areas of religion, language, and population. Almost from the moment that Roger I controlled much of the island, immigration was encouraged from Northern Europe, France, England, and Northern Italy, and Campania. For the most part, these consisted of Lombards of the Kingdom of Italy, who were vulgar Latin variety speaking and more inclined to support the Western Church. With time, Sicily would become overwhelmingly Roman Catholic, and a new vulgar Latin idiom would emerge that was distinct to the island. But at this point in history, it's a Greek-speaking area, and even southern Italy. So we have to remember this, that the dynamics of the present moment of state borders and so forth don't reflect back in history. They change. So the first of the popes that we're going to talk about is Gregory the Great, or Gregory the First. And he's extremely important. So I'm going to read to you from Father John Strickland's book, The Age of Paradise. This is a longer section, but he spends a lot of time discussing Gregory the Great because he is very much, he's the Bishop of Rome, but he's very much expresses the unity of the faith at this time between the East and the West, that there isn't this division that we think of today.
And Father, what year is that?
Gregory the Great, his papacy is 590 to 604. 590 to 604. So remember, Pope Leo is the one who first kind of puts forward this idea that the Bishop of Rome has some kind of authority that's higher than other churches at the time of the Council of Chalcedon in 451. And this is the Leo that our author is talking about. Leo's papal model of Christian Romanitas, or being Roman, was an historical anomaly when it appeared in the politically chaotic 5th century. Once imperial rule of Italy was restored by Justinian in the 6th century, it drifted back into relative obscurity, meaning nobody continued to express the same things that Leo was saying, Leo the Great, about the importance of the Bishop of Rome. Its eclipse was particularly evident during the pontificate of Gregory the Great, whose prestige came to surpass even that of Leo. Gregory belonged to a long line of popes, known for close ties to Constantinople and deep respect for the universal Romanness of society that encompassed the West and the East. Indeed, he had spent 7 years of his early life in Constantinople, or New Rome, as the papal apocrypharius, or envoy. This office had become an important means of testing future popes and provided them with valuable experience in the Eastern capital. When Gregory was elected pope in 590, he therefore brought an intimate knowledge of Eastern Christianity to the papacy. In fact, the 2.5 centuries that followed Justinian's reconquest have come to be known among historians as the period of a Byzantine papacy. During this period, popes were required to obtain imperial approval in Constantinople before their elections could be confirmed in Rome. What is more, many of the popes were of Greek origin, imported either from the East or from Byzantine southern Italy. Gregory, however, was not one of these. He was thoroughly a Roman, meaning from the city of Rome. The descendant of a long line of eminent patricians. In fact, one of his ancestors appeared to have been a pope himself. But Gregory's aristocratic lineage by no means left him indifferent to Rome's commoners. As a young man, he had been selected to serve as the city prefect, an office that introduced him to the nearly limitless needs of Rome's poor. He soon left this post to become a monk. As heir to an ancestral estate on the city's Calian Hill, he had the means of establishing a monastic community on the site in which the refinements of a Latin education were as important as ascetic struggle. Then, following his sojourn as papal envoy to Constantinople, Gregory returned home to find himself elected to the papacy. Gregory the Great is regarded as one of the most significant popes in the early history of Christendom. He was the first monk to be elected to the office of pope, and his ascetical piety left a deep imprint on it. He was the first pope to write prolifically, earning alongside Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine the distinction of being one of the 4 doctors of the Latin Church. His dialogues, documenting in 4 volumes the lives and miracles of Italian saints, became widely read and contributed greatly to the formation of a distinctly Western piety. Throughout the long work, Gregory presents a cosmology in which God is sacramentally present in this world, filling it with his awesome splendor. As his biographer, George D. Makopoulos notes, hear that name? Greek last name. In Gregory's theological view of the world, God remains active with his creation through visible and invisible ways. For the holy man, the ascetic, and all those who have committed themselves to a life of spiritual growth, the mysteries of God's intervention in the world are a source of comfort and hope. The second volume of the dialogues were dedicated exclusively to the life of St. Benedict of Nursa, whose monastic rule would become the most widely followed one in the West, but that would actually take some time. Here especially, the imprint of Eastern piety can be detected. Having read and absorbed the lives of Eastern saints like Anthony of Egypt while in Constantinople, Gregory resolved to provide equivalents for a Latin audience. According to Andrew Economou, the Pope would create in Benedict of Nursia an Italian Anthony, giving the afflicted peninsula and the entire West a superhuman figure whose sanctity could match that of the patriarch of Eastern monks. Gregory also enacted reforms of the Western liturgy, and it is to him personally that the dominant style of medieval singing, known as Gregorian chant, is attributed. Finally, he dispatched missionaries to Britain, bringing the peoples of that island more completely into the orbit of Christian Romatas. Ruling as he did during the period of the Byzantine papacy, Gregory might naturally be expected to have communicated Eastern elements of piety and practice to the West. The style of liturgical chant associated with his name might be an example of this, as Constantinople was in his time the center of the liturgical arts. Gregory is also credited in the East, there's no record of this in the West though, with an undisclosed contribution to the Lenten liturgy of the pre-sanctified gifts. This is Gregory the Dialogos, the one who writes, Dialogos meaning the dialoguer, the one who writes the dialogues. This service became the standard weekly liturgy in the East during the annual Great Fast, and in the West, a variant of it came to be used for the solemn day of Good Friday. Less elusive was Gregory's contribution to transmitting the ecclesiology of the East to the West. We have noted his predecessor Leo's innovative claims about the papacy's universal preeminence. Gregory does not seem to have shared these claims. In fact, on one significant occasion, he argued strongly against the principle of papal supremacy and any other form of universal ecclesiastical preeminence. The occasion was a statement made by the Patriarch of Constantinople, John the Faster. The latter sent a letter to Rome in 595 in which he assumed the title of Ecumenical Patriarch. This term had already been in use for some time and appears to have meant, due to the Patriarch's proximity to the capital, something like imperial rather than universal. Nevertheless, Gregory saw in it a dangerous precedent. He claimed in letters of protest that no single bishop could play with the thought that he exercised jurisdictional preeminence over all others, even in the name of St. Peter. What happened next in Gregory's correspondence with the East proved even more significant. He received a letter of sympathy from Patriarch Eulogius of Alexandria, who, in sharing a reluctance to address the Patriarch of Constantinople as Ecumenical Patriarch, addressed Gregory as Universal Pope. This title, too, had been used before by the popes, meaning Universal Father. Remember, Pope is just the informal way of saying Father, like Papa, the Universal Papa, right? Kind of a title of honor. But now Gregory decided, to his own disadvantage, to expose its flaw. The well-meaning Eulogius must have been stunned. Quote, "I beg you never let me hear that word again," unquote, Gregory humbly complained. Quote, "For I know who you are and who I am. In position, you are my brother. In character, my father. I gave, therefore, no commands, but only endeavored to point out what I thought was desirable. I said you ought not to use such a title," that is, Universal Bishop, "in writing either to me or to anyone else. Yet, now, in your last letter, notwithstanding my prohibition, you have addressed me by the proud title of Universal Pope. I beg your holiness, whom I love so well, not to do this again. I do not consider that anything is an honor to me by which my brethren lose the honor that is their due. My honor is the honor of the universal church. My honor is the united strength of my brethren. Then and then only am I truly honored, when no one is denied the honor which is justly his. But if your holiness calls me universal pope, you deny that you are yourself that which you say I am universally. God forbid. Far from us be the titles which inflate men's pride and deal a wound to charity. As forcefully as Cyprian of Carthage, and in striking contrast to Leo the Great, Pope Gregory hereby rejected the very possibility that any one bishop could exercise jurisdictional preeminence over others, even from Rome. A more eloquent expression of the East's conciliar ecclesiology could hardly be found, and in this case it was voiced by the most influential and famous pope of Christendom's first millennium. So that's Gregory the Great. In this time period, which preceded Gregory, remember 553 is the time of the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and the main work of that council by the Emperor Justinian, who called it, was try to bring about a healing of the schism that had occurred after Chalcedon with the churches that were referred to as Monophysite, trying to bring them back. But unfortunately, this council did not accomplish that. It didn't heal those wounds. In the time that came after that, other emperors tried to bring about this healing. But in this case, you saw emperors, in a sense, take authority that wasn't there, and they started to try to promulgate theology very much on their own, without and force specifically the bishops of the East, which they had, in a sense, a lot of more direct influence over, to accept their ideas. And in the midst of this, you have the emergence of two heresies, monoenergism and the monothelite heresies. So monophysitism means one nature. Monoenergism means one energy or one activity, and monothelitism means one light. And so these were ways that emperors were trying to make a bridge to the Monophysite churches to bring them back, to say, look, we accept everything that Cyril taught. And that Chalcedon wasn't contradicting Cyril of Alexandria at the Third Council. That's what all of these things were. But in trying to make a bridge, in a sense, they go too far. And they deny things about Christ, humanity, that are essential. One of the most important figures at this time who deals with this, the theological side of what the emperors are doing, is St. Maximus the Confessor. This is his time. In his early life, Maximus was a civil servant and an aide to the Roman Emperor Heraclius. Remember, he's the one that goes back and gets the true cross from Persia and brings it back. He gave up his life in the political sphere to enter the monastic life. Maximus had studied diverse schools of philosophy, and certainly what was common for his time, the Platonic dialogues, the works of Aristotle, and numerous later Platonic commentators on Aristotle and Plato, like Plotinus, Porphyry, Lamblicius, and Proclus. Okay, so again, this is the 600s. Greek thought has not been lost by anybody, as again, people like Edward Gibbons in the Enlightenment period would claim. He would claim that we're already in the Dark Ages, right? Fall of Rome, into the Dark Ages, all culture is lost. We're in the mid-600s, and Maximus the Confessor is an expert on all of these people. When one of his friends began espousing the Christological position known as monothelitism, Maximus was drawn into the controversy, in which he supported an interpretation of the Chalcedonian formula, on the basis of which it was asserted that Jesus had both a human and a divine will. So monothelitism asserted this idea of one light or one will. In Christ, there's only one will. And Maximus says, no, there can't be. There has to be two. He has to have a fully human will and a divine will. And the human will must submit to the divine will. Because if he doesn't have a human will, then human will is not sanctified. It's not saved. Because of what Gregory the theologian had said, what is not assumed is not saved. What is not taken up in Christ is not sanctified by Christ in his humanity. And that becomes, in a sense, the bellwether for understanding these things. And Maximus has this whole book called the Ambigua, where he talks about the hard sayings of Gregory the theologian. So he knows Gregory very well. The monothelite position was promulgated by Patriarch Sergius I of Constantinople, and by Maximus's friend and successor as abbot of the Chrysopolis, Pyrrhus. Following the death of Sergius in 638, Pyrrhus succeeds him as patriarch, but was shortly deposed owing to political circumstances, and Pyrrhus is exiled from Constantinople. Maximus and the deposed patriarch held a public debate on the issue of monothelitism. We have the text of this debate. You can read it in English. And the debate, which was held in the presence of many North African bishops, Maximus took the position that Jesus possessed both a human and a divine will. The result of the debate was that Pyrrhus admitted the error of the monothelite position. And Maximus, and they both, after this, went to Rome in 645. And it seems that Maximus remained in Rome from 645 to 649 because he's present when the newly elected Pope Martin I convened the Lateran Council of 649 at the Lateran Basilica in Rome. 105 bishops present condemned the monothelitism in the official acts of the synod, which many believe Maximus wrote. This was a synod held in Rome by the Bishop of Rome, relying on the theological vision of fathers from the East, as summarized by St. Maximus, and a host of Eastern monks who came to Rome to assist Maximus in his defense at this council. So we see, even in this little example, that there wasn't this division between East and West at this point, that the movement of people from Rome to Constantinople and back was very fluid and very frequent. And that the theology of the fathers of the East was very much welcome in the West. It was in Rome that Pope Martin and Maximus then are arrested in 653 under the orders of Constantius II, the emperor at the time, who was a supporter of the monothelite doctrine. So the idea from the emperor was, I want to hold society and the empire together. These religious differences are causing it strife. So I'll create one policy and I'll make everyone agree to it, and therefore bring unity. But his one policy wasn't accepted by anybody, or by and it was incorrect. It brought in a dangerous idea about the nature of Christ's humanity, in a sense that, if believed, in a sense, altered the nature of our salvation.
And who was the emperor?
Constans II. And so both Pope Martin and Maximus are arrested. Pope Martin dies before he's even brought to trial. In 662, Maximus is placed on trial for the second time and convicted of heresy, because he won't accept the heresy of the monothelites. And so his tongue was cut out and his right hand was cut off, so he could not speak or write. Maximus was then exiled to Lazica in the region of modern-day Georgia and was cast into a fortress there where he died, August 13th, 662. But 20 years later, the Sixth Ecumenical Council is held, 680 to 681, and it's this council that settled the question of monoenergism and monothelitism. Under the emperors Heraclius, who we've talked about, and Constance II, both of these things were promulgated by an imperial decree, these theological positions. Heraclius had set out to recover much of the part of his empire lost to the Persians and had attempted to bridge the controversy with the Monophysites, which was very strong in Syria and Egypt, by proposing theological positions that had as good support that he thought would solve the problem. And that was the first monoenergism, that Christ, though existing in two natures, divine and human, had one energy. The second was monothelitism, that Christ had one will, a divine will and no human will. This doctrine was accepted in many parts of the empire, the Eastern Empire, part of the empire, but opposed at Jerusalem and Rome. Saint Sophrony, the one who writes the life of Saint Mary of Egypt, is Maximus's teacher, companion, and patriarch of Jerusalem. It's that Sophrony who is the one upholding orthodoxy in Jerusalem at this time.
So after he left the monastery, he ended up becoming
Patriarch.
patriarch.
Yeah, he had to hand the keys over to the Muslims when the city was conquered. Finally, I believe. When Heraclius' grandson Constance II took the throne, he saw the controversy as threatening the stability of the empire and attempted to silence discussion by outlawing speaking either in favor or against the doctrine. You couldn't talk about it. That was his solution. And then, of course, he goes into arrest Pope Martin and Maximus. But it is then at Constantinople in around 680 to 681, after the time of Constance II, that a council is held in Constantinople. A letter by Pope Agatho was read, which asserted, as the traditional belief of the church, that Christ was of two wills, divine and human. Most of the bishops present accepted the letter, proclaiming that Peter spoke through Agatho, though this council also proclaimed another historical pope as anathema. So one pope was said to have spoken, that Peter spoke through him, but another pope was declared a heretic. So you can't read into sometimes the nice things that people say as being, in a sense, definitive of a certain position or of a bishop. Macarius of Antioch defended the monothelitism position, and he was condemned and deposed along with his partisans. The council, in keeping with Agatho's letter, defined that Jesus Christ possessed two energies and two wills, but that the human will was in subjection to his divine and all-powerful will. The council carefully avoided both monergism and monothelitism were declared heretical, and included those who had supported the heresy, including Pope Honorius I, who had supported monothelitism, and 4 previous patriarchs of Constantinople. So again, just as a reminder, we have no belief that just because you're a bishop, you're infallible, or that you're always right, or even as a priest. You have to uphold the faith. That's your job. You're not the definer of the faith. So 4 patriarchs of Constantinople and 1 pope of Rome were condemned as heretics at this council. When the council had concluded, the decrees were sent to Rome, where they were accepted by Agatho's successor, Pope Leo II. In his letter of confirmation of the council, Leo accuses Honorius, the Pope, who did not attempt to, so Honorius, the former Pope, he says, Honorius, who did not attempt to sanctify this apostolic church with the teaching of apostolic tradition, but by profane treachery permitted its purity to be polluted. And again, the measure that he's upholding is apostolic church upholds apostolic teaching and tradition. It's the teaching and the tradition that's authoritative. The bishop is the one who's supposed to uphold it. And then this brings us to what we call the Quintisex Council, or the Council of Trullo in 692. It's called, Quintisex means the fifth, sixth council. And it's also called the Council of Trullo because of kind of where it was held. Trullo being a word for dome, and it was held in a domed building. It was held at Constantinople under the imperial auspice of Justinian II. The fifth and sixth councils did not actually give any canons. They decided issues, but they didn't give any canons that addressed conduct of the clergy, conduct of the laity, or other questions that had arisen. And so this council was called, in a sense, to address a bunch of questions that, or issues that was felt to need to be clarified. So all this council does was issue canons. There's no one issue that they're wrestling with, like in the previous two. It's just they're issuing canons addressing many different issues. So many of the council were just reiterations of what had come before. It endorsed not only the sixth council, but also the apostolic canons, the Synod of Laodicea, and the third Synod of Carthage, and the 39th Festal Letter of Athanasius were all kind of brought into this status of being canonical, or having canonical authority to govern the church. But they also criticized some things that were done in Rome, some liturgical things that were done in Rome. And they also upheld the 28th canon of Chalcedon, which Rome had rejected. And so in Rome, Sergius I, who is the Pope from 687 to 701, he rejects the canons. He doesn't accept them. However, Pope Constantine, who follows him, in 711, appears to have accepted a compromise whereby Rome accepted the validity of the canons of the Quintisex Council while being allowed to continue existent Western practices where these were different. So even though some things were kind of criticized or condemned at this council as happening in 711, Pope Constantine goes to Constantinople, meets with the patriarch and the emperor, and they work out a compromise, basically. I'll recognize the council as being legitimate, but you're not going to come after me because I'm not going to change anything, basically. In consequence of the preceding, let's see. This kind of expressed, in a sense, that as the time was going on, you have some in the East that are feeling that, in a sense, strongly about this is how things should be done. And in the West, this is how things should be done. But at this point, they're able to find some compromise through it and kind of ratchet down the tension between the Bishop of Rome and the Patriarch of Constantinople. Gregory II, then in 715 to 731, who was Pope of Rome, this Gregory II in 716, received an official visit from Duke Theodo of Bavaria to discuss the continuing conversion of the lands to Christianity. So Bavaria is up in here, north of the Alps, right, southern Germany. This is an area that hadn't been fully Christianized. And the Duke of that area has come down and sought intentionally help in Christianizing his duchy. As a result of this meeting, Gregory gave special instructions to his delegation, who were then to travel to Bavaria, coordinate with the Duke, and establish a local church hierarchy overseen by an archbishop. Gregory maintained an interest in Bavaria, and in 726, he forced an unwilling Corbinian, after reviewing his appeal through a synod, to abandon his monastic calling, instead to become bishop of Frisia, Freising, in Upper Bavaria. And he sent this man who wanted to kind of leave the monastic calling, sent him instead to go be bishop up in northern Bavaria. Gregory next turned his attention to Germany. In 718, he was approached by an Anglo-Saxon missionary named Winfrid, who proposed undertaking missionary work in Germany. So Anglo-Saxon meaning he came from what we think of as England, and he comes to Rome to do missionary work in the northern part of Germany. Gregory agreed, and after changing his name to Boniface, commissioned him in May of 719 to preach in Germany. And this is St. Boniface, the apostle to the Germans. After hearing of the work that had been done so far in 722, Gregory summoned Boniface back to Rome to answer rumors concerning Boniface's doctrinal purity. At this face-to-face meeting, Boniface complained that he found Gregory's Latin difficult to understand, a clear indication that vulgar Latin had already started to evolve into the Romance languages at this point. Couldn't necessarily understand each other very well. After examining Boniface's written profession of faith, Gregory was satisfied enough that he made Boniface a bishop, and in November of 722, and returned him to Germany to continue his missionary work. Continued success saw Gregory write to Boniface in December of 724 to offer his congratulations, followed in November of 726 by a response to Boniface's questions about how to structure the newly emergent churches in Germany. Gregory also strengthened papal authority in the churches of Britain and Ireland. In 726, Gregory was visited by Ian, the former king of Wessex, who had abdicated the throne in order to undertake a pilgrimage to Rome and end his life there. This is what some of the nobility were doing. They would come in pilgrimage to Rome, in a sense, to die in the city of martyrs, because that's how Rome was seen, to be the great city of the martyrs. Gregory was able to maintain stable relations with the Lombard kingdom to the north and negotiate on behalf of the empire with the Lombards. So in 726, Leo issued an iconoclast edict condemning possession of icon of the saints. Although Leo made no move to enforce this edict in the West, beyond having it read in Rome and Ravenna, Gregory immediately rejected it. Leo meaning Leo the Isaurian, the founder of iconoclasm. This is now right at the beginning of the period of iconoclasm, which is again Roman emperors trying to impose theological and religious ideas on everyone, circumventing the bishops. But Gregory immediately rejects it. Gregory II writes to Emperor Leo III, quote, "You say we worship stones and walls and boards, but it is not so, O Emperor. But they serve us for remembrance and encouragement, lifting our slow spirits upwards by those whose names the pictures bear and whose representations they are. And we worship them not as God, as you maintain, God forbid. Even the little children mock at you. Go into one of their schools, say that you are the enemy of images, and straightway they will throw their little tablets at your head. and what you have failed to learn from the wise you may pick up from the foolish. In virtue of the power which has come down to us from St. Peter, the Prince of the Apostles, we might inflict punishment upon you, but since you have invoked one on yourself, have that, you and the counselors you have chosen. Though you have so excellent a high priest, our brother Germanus, whom you ought to have taken into your councils as father and teacher, the dogmas of the church are not a matter for the emperor, but for the bishops. And the Germanus he's talking about is the Patriarch of Constantinople, who Gregory writes to and supports. And this Germanus abdicates, and Gregory refuses to acknowledge the new Patriarch, Anastasius, because he was an iconoclast. Gregory died 11 February 731. And Gregory III, who comes after him, is the last bishop of Rome to seek imperial approval through the Exarch of Ravenna for his election, largely because iconoclasm ruins relations between Rome and the East for 100 years. So, fortunately, that's what happens. So again, the point here is the world we live in now and the borders we have now aren't the borders they had then. And so we can't, in a sense, take what we know by our own experience and place it back on the church in the past. The way the church understood what they were trying to do in society is not the same exactly of what we conceive of as ourselves. They were engaging an empire for the first time and making it Christian. We are living in a time where empires don't exist so much anymore, and nation states have rejected their Christian heritage and don't want to be identified even as being Christian half the time. So we're living in a very different context. So it's very dangerous for us, in a sense, to stand in judgment of them in a context that we ourselves don't necessarily even understand. And in a sense, the government of the society was an imperial structure. We don't live in that. We've largely, especially the United States, we've largely rejected the idea of monarchy, even though we love the kings and queens of England, right? It's like superstars and, all the paparazzi and the intrigue. Like, we love that kind of gossip stuff. And the idea of nobility, we just don't want it implemented in any way in our culture. But it's novel to us. So we live in a very different context than they did, where they're actively trying to, in a sense, live out their Christian faith, not just in their own lives, but in society as a whole, because that's what society as a whole is attempting to do. And of course, the emperors at times will fail at this miserably, even to as we see here, the detriment of the faith. And to the unity of the church as a whole. This is one of those, iconoclasm will be one of these markers that causes division long term, unfortunately, and sets for the decline in Christian relations. So, questions? All right. God bless you all. Next week, we will talk about, we'll talk about not iconoclasm, but the conversion of the Slavs.
Conversion of
the Slavs, Slavic tribes. So we'll see you next week.